Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to today's morning briefing. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Kaiser Forum, a new initiative here at DGAP for strategic questions to be launched later this year. Today, we are looking at the geopolitical implications of the conflict in the Middle East, especially as they relate to Russia and Russia's war against Ukraine, and in turn, the effects on German and European foreign policy. Since Israel's strikes against Iran on the 13th of June, Iran's retaliation, and the American bombardment of 3 nuclear sites, notably the Fordo uranium enrichment plant on Sunday, observers have been nervously watching the situation, worrying that the conflict might spin out of control. Yet, as of now, all parties seem content with the status quo, a scenario almost too good to be true. And of course it was. On Tuesday, US media outlets reported that according to a preliminary classified US report, the American bombing set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months, which the Trump administration denies. So have Israel and US achieved what they wanted by preemptively hitting Iran in a strike that experts widely regard as incompatible with international law? What are the military consequences for Iran and its allies, notably Russia, that has been a fairly reliable partner in the Khamenei-Putin era? Or is it just a transactional relationship, as András, Rácz, today's speaker, and some colleagues are arguing in a recent article in Internationale Politik, DGAP's magazine, an article that my colleague will share in the chat shortly. What are the effects on Russia's war in Ukraine? In a Spiegel interview just this week, Foreign Minister Johann Wadefuhl said that he was worried that the Israel-Iran conflict would drag attention away from Ukraine. Now, what should Germany and Europe do to protect their own security interests? To discuss these and other questions, I am delighted to introduce today's panel. First up will be Jörg, who is a leading German journalist and public intellectual. He is the international editor with German weekly Die Zeit, where he has worked since 1997, covering a wide range of topics, including German foreign policy in the Middle East. He spent time in the US as a GMF fellow and also at Harvard Center for European Studies. He's a frequent contributor to Internationale Politik and this morning briefing series. And he has a piece in today's edition of Die Zeit, unpacking the details of a conflict in which all parties see themselves as winners. This article will also be shared in the chat shortly. Next up will be Dr. Hanna Notte, who's the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. She's also a senior non-resident associate with the Europe, Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC. She's the author of a book on radiological weapons called Death Dust, which came out in 2023 with Stanford University Press. And she has 2 recent pieces out on today's topic. One in the Atlantic on why Russia isn't defending Iran, came out on the 18th of June, and the other one just yesterday on why Russia no longer needs Iranian drones. These 2 pieces also to be shared in the chat by my colleague. Last but not least, Dr. András Rácz is a senior fellow at DGAP's Center for Security and Defense. He is basically a co-founder of this morning briefing series and a frequent contributor on all things military, especially in all parts of the world that President Putin claims for himself. He has held previous positions at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki and the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and the GMF. Welcome back to the morning briefing, András Rácz. Now, before we begin, as per usual, just to let you know that we are recording this event and will upload it subsequently. We will start our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions and answers after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, briefly introduce yourself, and keep your question or comment relatively brief so we can keep this nice and interactive. Finally, let me just thank all my colleagues supporting this morning briefing series: Milan Nitsch, Helga Beck, Lili Tran, Patrick Teichmann, Eva Kopinek, and many others. Now, without much further ado, let me hand things over to you, Jörg, for perhaps an overview of a very complicated situation in the Middle East that is still unfolding. Can you help us make sense of it?
Well, let me try. Thank you. Um, a very strange war, indeed. Um, I decided to talk a bit about what we know, what we don't know, and then make maybe some remarks about what Europe and Germany um, can do in this conflict that seems to be over kinetically at the moment, but definitely is not over diplomatically and might even start over if the ceasefire doesn't hold. So a really strange situation. Everybody's celebrating Jerusalem, Washington, most of all Tehran. Headline of the Tehran Times yesterday: victory was achieved, but Iran's finger remains on the trigger. But Donald Trump, as we saw at a NATO summit yesterday, also claims total obliteration of the nuclear program, and Israel says it has achieved all strategic aims. So, what do we know? Um, some remarks. Israel has crossed the Rubicon and taken the shadow war that has been raging for years, if not decades, into the daylight. Israel seems to enjoy air superiority, deep penetration of Iran's security apparatus, and likely also the nuclear program. The ballistic missile program has been severely degraded. Nuclear facilities appear to be heavily destroyed. There's a debate going on between different agencies how much has been destroyed, but I think we can assume that severe damage has been done to these facilities. A huge part of the leadership of the IRGC has been eliminated, and Iran seems to be mostly on its own. Russia and China remain muted. I guess Hanna Notte can say more about how Russia sees this situation. Regional powers are standing to gain from further containment of Iran's meddling in the region. So I guess uh, there is some relief in some of the capitals around the Gulf. And Netanyahu, and this is a major success for him, has managed to pull the U.S. into this conflict after four presidents denied him the wish to join him in his campaign against Iran. And I would say, from Israel's point of view, from the low point of October 7 to what happened after June 13, Israel really turned the tables in a spectacular fashion, from existential vulnerability to being almost a hegemon in the region, at least militarily for the moment. For the Iranian regime, I think we can say it's it's weakened, but it also survived attacks from the two most sophisticated militaries in the world, and that is also an achievement. So, briefly, what we don't know what the terms of the ceasefire are. Are there any terms? What happens if it is violated? What we also don't know is how long the setback of Iran's nuclear program will last. Where are the 400 kilograms of highly enriched material? Was Fordo destroyed, as Trump claims, or just severely damaged and only taken offline for a while? Has Iran emergency plans in place to continue enriching and dashing towards the bomb? Did this war change the calculus of the Iranian leadership towards accelerating the weaponization or towards accommodation and deal making? This is I think, totally open, an open question. Is the regime weakened to a degree that regime change from within becomes possible? Or will the regime lash out even harsher against dissent? And are we headed for a full-blown military dictatorship in Iran with the IRGC taking over? And from a broader perspective, were these strikes a breakthrough for nuclear non-proliferation, demonstrating how dangerous striving for the bomb is, or will they foster proliferation, having proven how good it is to have a bomb and be invulnerable? Finally, will this become an endless war when the regime survives and reconstitutes its air defense, ballistic, and nuclear programs, with Israel and maybe the US striking over and over again? And just one more word about Germany, Europe. I think we have at the moment no role to play because we are not united on Gaza and only a little bit more so on how we view the strikes on Iran. For Germany, it's remarkable that Germany had just begun shifting its stance on the war in Gaza ever so slightly. From my point of view, too little and too late. But nevertheless, those were the right steps. Germany had begun criticizing the way Israel conducts the war in Gaza. But now in the Iranian case, there is full solidarity. The chancellor even claimed Israel was doing our dirty work. And Gaza seems to disappear, which I guess the German leadership in some way enjoys because it was a very uncomfortable conversation to be had about Gaza. So just one.
If you can finish the sentence, yes.
Yeah, one last sentence. Whatever Israel achieves militarily, and that is a remarkable feat, will not count for much if it cannot be translated into a new regional order, including the Palestinians. The alternative is perpetual war.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Jörg. Thanks for raising important questions and answering some. We will certainly come back to Germany's perspective on the conflict in the region, and we might have to save the reordering of the region and the future peace order that might be possible in the Middle East for some future morning briefing. But we'll try to pick some of that in the Q&A. For now, I think there are some questions that directly lead us to Hanna Notte. Perhaps you could give us an overview of Iran-Russia relations. Why isn't Russia defending Iran, and why does Russia not rely on Iranian drones anymore, to raise the questions that your recent articles pick up? Over to you, Hanna.
Thank you so much. Thank you to DGAP for hosting me this morning, for inviting me. I want to take a step back from this war and sort of look at Russia in the Middle East after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, to just recall that the Ukraine war and confrontation with the West over Ukraine became the key organizing principle of Russian foreign policy globally. And what that meant in the Middle East over the last 3+ years is that Russia nudged somewhat closer to the anti-Western forces in the region, meaning Iran and its partners in the axis of resistance. That was a matter of practical necessity because Russia turned to Iran for the Shahed drones and their production technology. But there was also an ideological underpinning to this anti-Western tilt. The Kremlin became less interested in cooperation with the West in the Middle East on dossiers like Syria or the Iran nuclear file. And of course, the Middle East also became an arena for potential Russian horizontal escalation against the West. This anti-Western tilt further intensified after the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, because Russia saw an opportunity to tap into anti-Western and anti-Israeli sentiments, especially in global fora. But I would actually argue that the dynamics that were ushered in the Middle East by October 7th eventually proved too intense for Russia to steer into a favorable direction. We saw the limitations of Russian power in the Middle East already last year, as Israel took on Iran and its partners in the axis of resistance. We had the strikes in April and October, Russia was by and large a bystander to those events, to the weakening of Hezbollah, which were one factor that led, I think, to the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria last December. Russia didn't do all that much. And these limitations have become most apparent over the last 2 weeks in the context of this war. So briefly, what have we seen? We have seen no signs of Russian military assistance to Iran. I'm very happy to talk a bit more in the Q&A about what Russia could have done realistically. I think very little. To me, the more incisive point is what Russia did not do last year to mitigate Iran's vulnerability, deliver certain systems to Iran. We didn't see that. Diplomatically, politically, of course, the Russian MFA is saying what it needs to say about Israeli and US aggression, violation of the UN Charter. But I would actually argue that Russia has been more cautious in its rhetoric over the last 2 weeks. It's not going overboard with an anti-Israeli or anti-US rhetoric. Last week at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, I thought Putin was actually trying to sound quite even-handed. Even noting the Russian speaking diaspora in Israel and talking about Israeli security interests as much as Iran's legitimate interests in peaceful nuclear energy. I think this is partially in recognition of the power realities as they're shaping up in the Middle East. Jörg noted the tables have turned, and this is not lost on Moscow. So you don't want to go all in rhetorically, politically with a weakened Iran. I think it's also partially because of the Trump administration and sort of bigger Russian plays. But all things considered, this war is an undesirable reality for Russia because it exposes both Iranian but also Russian weakness. And it's, of course, fraught with further risks of escalation going forward. I agree with the many unknowns that Jörg sort of pointed out. And further escalation, I think, is not to Russia's interests. I do want to make a sort of quick caveat to this argument that this shows that Russia is weak and that Russia is an quote unquote unreliable ally. Observers sort of point from the abandonment of the Karabakh Armenians in September 2023 to the fall of Assad last December to what's happening to Iran now to make the point that Russia is an unreliable ally. But I think that sort of misses the point about how Russia looks at allies. Russia supports partners in expectation of concrete gain at a calculable risk to the Kremlin. And to my mind, Russia was never going to defend Iran militarily in a direct confrontation with Israel or the United States, even without the war in Ukraine. I think that was always off the table. The priority to the Kremlin is subjugating Ukraine and revising the security architecture in Europe. And when Russia has to prioritize in terms of its global power projection, it will do that, And yes, I wrote yesterday that what is happening in the Middle East, as undesirable as it is to Russia, I think will have limited impact for Russia on the battlefield in Ukraine. Again, sort of can go deeper into this in the Q&A, but Russia having localized the production of the Shahed drones and modified them, sourcing its components from elsewhere and having substantial North Korean support, I think is not reliant on Iran at this time to prosecute the war in Ukraine. Just 2 words on what to expect from Russia going forward on this conflict in the Middle East. Again, much depends on what we will see. Will we see US-Iranian talks? Will we see further rounds of strikes? I think politically it's interesting that Trump appears to chill towards the idea of Russia helping mediate. He said it again in The Hague yesterday. It's nice of Putin to offer help, but I need help from Putin on Russia, Ukraine, and not Iran. So sort of sort out your own conflict first. There's always theoretically a technical role to be played for Russia if we find an agreement in a zone where Iran is allowed some enrichment, because Rosatom has a technical role to play there. But, that sort of depends on where we're going on the zero enrichment question. And what we will definitely see, I think, and we're already seeing it, is Russia emerging as sort of a shielder of Iran in multilateral fora on the UN Security Council at the IAEA this week. That's a role that Russia will play. Militarily, Iran will need to reconstitute. It's going to be very interesting to what extent Iran will actually turn to Russia, given the poor performance of Russian air defenses, radars, whether perhaps the Iranians are looking more towards China as a partner in the future. I think these are open questions. But yeah, my bottom line here is that these events do show the limitations of Russia's global power projection at a time when Russia is bogged down in an unwinnable war in Ukraine. But I don't think that we should therefore sort of draw the conclusion that Russia will ease off in Ukraine. I don't think that it will be forced to do that because of the events in the Middle East.
Thanks so much, Hanna. And again, I think this is a perfect segue for András to take over. And as we're moving from Tehran to Moscow, András, how is the conflict in the Middle East impacting Russia's war in Ukraine? I suppose you agree with a lot of what Hanna said on the transactional nature of Russia as an actor. Perhaps you can give us some more military details. Over to you, András.
Thank you. Thank you again to all of you for joining us today morning. And actually, I feel quite lucky speaking after Hanna, because she literally took half of my points about how should we address the question of Russia being a reliable ally or not, and also how, while rearming herself, how much Iran would rely actually on Russia's weapons. So Hanna, thank you. You won several important minutes for me, in which I can speak about something else. So when it comes to the implications for Russia's war in Ukraine, Hanna outlined already the strategic and the diplomatic aspects. I have just one thing to add, kind of a true finger to the diplomatic aspects. It was very interesting to watch that during the 2 weeks of conflict, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which Iran, Russia, and China are all members, was not even mentioned. So actually, this conflict, when any members of the SCO get engaged into a war, this conflict actually calibrated the real significance of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or to be more exact, the absence of any significance here. When it comes to the operational tactical implications for Russia's war in Ukraine, there are positive and negative sides for Russia. Hanna already mentioned that during the Israeli and the US air campaign, it turned out that Russian weapon systems, radar systems, electronic warfare systems, very important, are practically useless against top-notch military capabilities, even of Israel, not to mention the United States. I mean, Russia failed to deliver Iran the long requested S-400s and also the Sukhoi fighter jets. However, Moscow delivered a considerable batch of electronic warfare systems. They didn't have much. So this will probably hamper Russia's position also on the global arms market, because this was a live combat test of Russian-made weaponry against highest quality Western weapons, and Russian weaponry clearly lost this kind of comparison. So that's one negative aspect. There's a direct tactical negative aspect as well. There have been news, and probably Hanna's colleagues know a lot more about that. Last year, there have been news about Iran possibly delivered ballistic missiles to Russia. However, none of these missiles have ever been fired so far. Recently, news emerged that Iran might deliver also the launchers for these missiles, because originally, as strange as it sounds, probably only some of the missiles were delivered, but not the launching vehicles. After these 2 weeks of air campaigns, it is extremely unlikely that Iran could afford delivering any launchers to Russia, because on the bottleneck on their side is the shortage of missile launchers, because Israel was very much going after the missile launchers. So whatever number of missile launchers Iran still has, they can't really afford sending any of them to Russia. So here, Russia is unlikely to be able to count on Iranian-made ballistic missiles. But again, I fully subscribe to what Hanna said. When it comes to ballistic missile supplies, Russia is a lot more reliant on North Korea, and North Korean missile outputs, the KN-23s, is not only increasing in numbers, but Russia and North Korean engineers are working on improving the accuracy of the North Korean-made ballistic missiles, and interoperability with Russian systems is almost completely achieved. So Russia would not need much of the Iranian missiles. It would still be kind of a nice to have thing, but not a must have anymore. So that's kind of a negative effect. When it comes to the positive effects, and positive in a distorted sense, so really from Moscow's point of view, first, the longer the conflict lasts, I mean, the armed phase of the conflict lasts over Iran, the less international attention is paid to Ukraine. Meaning Russia gets a bit freer hand simply because international attention is diverted. And this diversion is manifested also in weapon shipments. Because particularly for the United States, if they have to prioritize whom to supply air defense weapons, to Israel or to Ukraine, Israel would be the clear priority. One case has already been disclosed, 20,000 shipment of 20,000 light anti-drone missiles, the 70 millimeters converted Hydras. This missile shipment was redirected from Ukraine to Israel to help Israeli and also US forces in the region to counter incoming Iranian drones. So this one is already public, both the redirection and also the number. What may also come, Ukraine is in desperate need of more advanced air defense systems, particularly Patriots. However, the longer the conflict runs against Iran, I mean the armed conflict, the higher the chance is that if there are any extra Patriots on the market, the US would prefer sending them to Israel and not to Russia, affecting both the launchers and the missiles for those launchers. Meaning here Europe will have to play a larger role strengthening Ukraine's air defense if this one is possible. And both of these two developments, so less anti-drone weapons and less air defense weapons to Ukraine, this in the short and medium run will function as enablers of Russia's drone campaign against Ukraine. So this is fairly bad news for Ukraine and would help or support Russia's war, the air war against Ukraine. It's not going to turn the ground.
Can you come to an end, András?
Naval war, but in terms of the air war, very hard months are awaiting Ukraine, particularly the summer and the early autumn, because they are critically short of modern air defense weapons.
András,
the immediate implications, and if you happen to have any questions, I'm trying my best to answer them. And thank you again, Hanna, for taking half of my points. Thanks.
Sorry to interrupt you, András, but we do want to get into the Q&A, and I encourage everyone in the audience to raise their virtual hands and ask questions. And as you come up with questions, let me perhaps come back to you for a moment, and also the other speakers with some brief follow-ups. You mentioned, András, military cooperation not working so well between some of the authoritarian states out there. You didn't talk a lot about what's happening on the Western side so far. We just come out of the NATO summit, so I wonder whether you want to say a word on how the Western alliance has positioned itself at all. Also, another point that you raised, Jörg, in the beginning, what this means for non-proliferation in general. And since Hanna works at a center for non-proliferation, I wonder if you want to say a word on that. And finally, I wanted to ask, since Jörg, you talked about the role of the German government, it wasn't informed. I think one piece in DW yesterday called it Germany was in diplomatic no man's land, very much kept in the dark. So what does it mean for the German perspective in this conflict more broadly? Perhaps we go in the same order, starting with Jörg and Hanna Notte, and then András Rácz. Finally, feel free also to react to one another. And once we're done with this round, then we'll open up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. I think it's even worse than the German government not being informed. The last dash towards negotiations on Friday was actually used by the US government as a kind of decoy, while they already had decided on intervention with the B-2 bombers and the bunker busters. So they were part of the ruse that protected that military intervention that was already on the way. So this is a pretty desperate situation for German diplomacy. I mean, I think diplomacy in general has been not really helped by the way this was conducted. Why should Iran trust anybody and come to the table except for, to protect themselves from more strikes? It's unclear if anybody is really interested in a diplomatic solution, or if this is just a smokescreen for more military pressure. So that's a very difficult situation, I think, for Germany and Europe, who have no military role to play anyhow, are only maybe able to be mediators, but I think nobody takes the Europeans seriously at the moment. So they're basically watching and joining the US in saying maybe this was a necessary action. Yeah.
Hanna, Notte.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question, and I think it's somewhat premature to speculate what countries like Saudi Arabia or South Korea or Japan or even countries in Europe might draw by way of conclusions from the situation, because it hasn't fully shaken out. Having said that, I think the basic impression here is that unless you have nuclear weapons, you actually have them, as opposed to just being a threshold state, which Iran was for many years. You can be struck. You can be military targeted. I mean, we have now the situation that Iran has tried to deter, for decades, and ultimately it failed. We've seen initial Russian reactions to this Israeli and US attack. Sort of Russian pundits and even some officials coming out and saying, well, the lesson here is, thank God we have nuclear weapons, and sort of hinting, I think, that there will only be a doubling down on the Russian side when it comes to their own nuclear deterrent, because they know how important it is to deter certain Western actions against Russia. So that's not good news for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I think there's also interesting lessons to be learned from this whole episode about a nuclear threshold status, because I think we thought for quite some time that the combination for Iran of having the network of partners and proxies, plus the missile arsenal, which turned out to be less formidable than many thought, plus the nuclear threshold status, so being quite close to the threshold but not crossing it, gave it deterrence in the region. And that's turned out not to be true, because Israel dismantled the two pillars and then took on Iran's nuclear program. I think we thought in the community that other states might aspire to have threshold status without crossing the threshold. But I think there's questions to be asked how much that does for you if you can actually be targeted with threshold status. The last thing I'll say, perhaps, is that we're already, I think, now seeing the Iran issue becoming, an irritant factor in the multilateral fora that deal with non-proliferation. We have, I think, now Russia trying to shield Iran at the IAEA, making arguments that it's unfair to insist that inspectors have to be led back into the country, that the priority should be to condemn Israeli and US strikes and not lean on Iran. I think this will kind of poison things at the IAEA General Conference and probably on the board. It's pretty rich coming from Russia having occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant for more than 3 years and generally posed such a grave threat to the nuclear order, to now sort of be, putting its finger on Israeli and US actions. But here we are for obvious reasons. And I think in terms of sort of cooperation in the multilateral fora that deal with nuclear issues, this will be yet another irritant that will throw wrenches and that will make it harder in the NPT context or at the IAEA to sort of find positive cooperation. So that's perhaps another factor worth keeping in mind.
Thanks a lot, Hanna. It sounds like this will keep you busy over the next months and years to watch and analyze. András, did you want to come in as well?
Just very shortly, I mean, I'm not going to address European security issues because I'm a Russia guy and don't want to pretend that I'm a professional or something, which I'm not. When it comes to Russia's role in international fora regarding this conflict, I mean, this was basically a masterclass how Russian diplomacy with bright blue eyes condemned the unprovoked aggression against a sovereign country. This was beautiful. Without the blink of an eye, the classic best Russian diplomacy, shameless as they always have been. So from the professional perspective, despite the clear contrast with what Russia has actually been doing in Ukraine, this was very, very interesting. Still, putting intellectual pleasure aside, I mean pleasure in quotation marks, it was also spectacular to note how quickly Russia's mediation effort was turned down by everybody. So unlike in Karabakh, unlike in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, here no significant player took Russia seriously. And it was, of course, the diplomatic style of Donald Trump, who basically rebuffed Putin publicly. This is, again, I would say, the new style of diplomacy, not necessarily a good one. And one thing to add, which is still not entirely clear, but looks quite possible, Russia was also surprised by the attack. So it looks like that Russia's remaining radar installations, so the long-range radar in Armavir, southern Russia, which was damaged by the Ukrainians 2 years ago, as well as the very low number of airborne radar systems, the A-50s. Russia has so limited radar capacity left, long-range radar capacity, that probably they were unaware of what was coming. And they were certainly unable to provide Iran with any kind of actionable intelligence on the actions of either the Israeli or the US Air Force. So this is another lesson to learn, that Russia's capacities to provide, I mean, actual actionable military support to any foreign partners was probably more limited than many would have assumed. Over.
Thanks, András. Again, you're warmly invited to raise your hands and come forward and ask questions by clicking on the reactions button and raise your virtual hand, and I'll take your comments and questions. Meanwhile, we have a first question by Tadaguni in the chat, who is asking about the potential disruption of the Hormuz Strait. Is it likely, she asks, given Iran's dependency on oil exports to China and the shaky ceasefire? I wonder if Jörg might want to pick this up.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. Iranian parliament has voted on a motion to do this. That was the news, I think, 2 days ago, but it hasn't happened yet. And that, I think, relates to exactly the second point in this question. I think it would be kind of a suicidal move by Iran, cutting themselves off from the most important income they have, which is selling oil to China. So I think all the retaliatory moves that are possible for Iran seem, in that sense, quite suicidal at the moment. They're really in a totally helpless situation, which is something that many people are cheerful about, but I think there is a broader point here that needs some reflection, and that's the breakdown of deterrence that we're witnessing in so many cases at the moment. It was the case on the 7th of October with Israel when Hamas attacked, obviously thinking that they would have some kind of success there. Israel obviously had to reconstitute their deterrence. Ukraine has witnessed the same thing, and the point that András made about Russian air defense being basically useless is also a very, very important point that will, I think, make military planner rethink their strategy. And this is a phenomenon that creates a lot of uncertainty, I think, in many arenas, that it's really unclear when deterrence works and how you can, rebuild it after it has broken down. Israel has done that, but can it sustain that on 7 fronts for a long period of time? That's unclear also, I think.
Thanks, Jörg. There is another question by Boris Ginsburg, who's throwing in Turkey in the mix and also Syria, and is wondering about the network of relationships between Israel, Syria, Turkey, and Russia. So that's a complicated one. And then there's one for you, I think, Hanna, by Sarah Nurton, who's asking about the potential help of Russia for Iranian nuclear capabilities. Is there any circumstances in which Russia would offer help to Iran in this respect? There is another question by Joe Mack about the US potential desire for regime change in Iran. Now that seems to be on hold for the time being, but is that perhaps back on the table some point in the near future? Hanna, can I ask you to go first, and then we'll bring in the others, and we'll also bring in more questions that I see are coming.
I'm happy to say a few words about the first 2 questions. So when it comes to Russia, Israel, Turkey, Syria, I think, let me make a basic statement, which is that Russia believes that it can best pursue its interests in the Middle East if there's a certain balance between these regional players. Russia doesn't like Israel or Turkey to be too strong in the region. And of course, with the fall of Assad in Syria, and now with Iran's weakening, sort of the regional balance of power has become a bit lopsided from Russia's point of view. And that has implications not just for the Middle East, but also for the South Caucasus, where Israel and Iran are players, where Turkey is a player that has gained in leverage over the last 3 years, especially because of developments in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's a region for which Russia has had less bandwidth because of the war in Ukraine. And so I think that is something that worries Russia, that a weakened Iran will sort of have less power projection into the South Caucasus as well, and that will further elevate Turkey, potentially Israel, and then these powers have more cards to play vis-a-vis Russia, including in other theaters. I mean, let's not forget that Russia and Turkey are both present in Libya, for example, as well. And so Russia is interested in a certain balance. Now, so is Israel in a way. It's quite interesting, if you look at Syria, the Russians are still in Syria. They retain their military presence in Hmeimim and Tartus for the time being. And it seems to me like Russia will be able to work something out with the new Syrian authorities. That's at least my hunch at this time. And it seems to be that Israel prefers that as well. When I was in Israel earlier this year, there was a certain sense that the Russians are really weak now. They couldn't prevent Assad from falling. They're no longer now a factor for Israel to reckon with in terms of freedom of maneuver over Syrian skies. But then Israel thinks, well, what if we have a super strong Turkey in the region and a Syria that is sort of overtly dominated by Turkey? That is not in Israel's interest either. And so I think from an Israeli point of view, you might actually want the Russian military to retain a certain presence in Syria in order to produce a certain balance. So those are some thoughts on sort of the constellation of these actors. On Russia and nuclear Iran, look, I mean, Russia's played a role in Iran's civilian nuclear program, right, for a long time, and the Russians are in Bushehr, and that's what Putin mostly talked about last week. That he told Trump and Bibi that Bushehr shouldn't be targeted, and that Russian specialists are on the ground. And I can sort of see a role for Russia going forward on the Iranian nuclear program. There were reports over the last years of certain information or certain support being passed to Iran also on the nuclear weapons program, though in the open source, I believe it was never specified what that support was. As a general matter, I would say that even though we've had arguments in the Russian strategic community over the last few years that because the West, quote unquote, needs to relearn how to fear nuclear war and Russia needs to restore its coercive nuclear credibility, it might actually be preferable for Russia if there's a multipolar nuclear world emerging. That was an argument that some people in Russia made. And why would it be so bad if our allies, if our partners have nuclear weapons? I'm not sure that that argument ever represented consensus view in the Kremlin. It is still my hunch that Russia, all things considered, does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Russia was very comfortable with Iran sitting close at the nuclear threshold, but not crossing it, because Russia, first of all, still looks at nuclear weapons as a status symbol, as a capability that's reserved for a few great countries. I don't think it necessarily wants that club to become bigger, especially because Russia will rely on nuclear weapons itself more for deterrence and coercion. And Russia must also calculate that it would lose leverage over a nuclear-armed Iran. Plus, the developments over the last 2 weeks show, and the fall of Assad show, how quickly things can change. And you cannot be certain, depending on how things shake out in Iran, that there would be a friendly regime, friendly to Moscow, in power in the future. And so all things considered, I don't think that Russia wants a nuclear-armed Iran.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree, András?
Absolutely. So I just add a few really small things about the non-military aspect of Iran's nuclear program, and particularly Russia's participation in it. Actually Soviet involvement and Russian involvement in the Iranian nuclear program goes back for decades. There is a very strong technological dependency on the Iranian side, and from the Russian side also engagement, as well as Rosatom's own interest. I mean, colleagues, Rosatom is the world's largest nuclear company. And it's a nuclear company of not only of global scale, but also of global quality. So these are not old buhankas running around in the Ukrainian battlefield and partially working, partially not. No, Rosatom is a serious company. So for them, participating in the peaceful nuclear program of Iran is important also as a form of global reference. Rosatom keeps expanding globally, acquiring newer and newer contracts. And it's not only Akkuyu in Turkey, not only the reactors in India. Rosatom is about to build an experimental reactor in Bolivia and in other places as well. So for Rosatom, for the civilian side, it is important to remain engaged in Iran's peaceful nuclear program, both for business perspective, strategic perspective, and also from the perspective of global reference. That see, even if your country is under Western sanctions, Russia and Rosatom is here to help. So this is the Russian interest in remaining engaged is not only the military aspects, but also the civilian. I mean, Rosatom is a major player inside the Russian political system, also because of the strategic implications Hanna described.
Thanks a lot, András. I'll hand it over to you, Jörg, in a second. There is the question about regime change. There's another question by Faulkner Hatje about the likelihood of potentially a part of the Iranian elite concluding that past foreign policy has been mistaken and needs to be revised. So, if you will, a part regime change, or at least a policy change. And then we have China coming up, but perhaps we'll leave this for the next round. Over to you, Jörg.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. the regime change question, it's for me, it's really hard to say how serious this war aim really was or is, because it was really confusing, the communication about war aims for this campaign. Was it just a way of coercing the Iranian regime by threatening them with strikes against regime institutions like the Basij militia or the Evin prison compound that we witnessed some days ago, because neither the Americans nor the Israelis obviously were willing to put boots on the ground to really force regime change. So it was always just about setting the stage for some kind of popular rebellion that to me seems at the moment more of a fantasy, because there's not much happening there since the brutal clampdown of the regime against several of these movements. The last one, the Woman Life Freedom movement we've seen. So I also think that was not really helping, because it's really really contradictory. I mean, if you want to bring the regime to negotiations and you threaten them with an overthrow, that's quite a contradiction. So related to that, the Iranian elite, might there be a rethinking of their foreign policy? Well, they obviously should, because it's a total failure at the moment. I mean, they've lost almost everything. They have their back to the wall. Will they rethink their strategic thinking about having all these proxy militias working for them, meddling in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq? I don't think so, because Iran basically is in the same situation as before. They're isolated. They still think of themselves as being in a resistance to the arrogant world powers that threaten them. So they need an answer to that. And I don't see that they go for negotiations, accommodation, being a stakeholder in the region. I rather think they will be cautiously rethinking how they can come up with another plot to somehow preserve their interests in the region.
Eva Kopinek is raising a question about China, and I'll give you both Hanna and András a chance to react in a second as well. Eva Kopinek is raising a question about China's role in this conflict in the region more generally. Perhaps we could link this also with the upcoming BRICS summit in early July and any prospects of collaboration among some of the member states, including, of course, Russia and Iran. So a chance for Hanna to react and pick up any of the remaining questions, and then András next.
I'll just add very briefly to what Jörg said, which I very much agree with. I mean, if we look at the pillars of Iranian deterrence and coercion in the region, the proxies or partners, the missiles, and then the nuclear, and sort of think about where Iran might go from here. Just a couple of additional thoughts. I guess it's quite interesting to see how the proxies or partners did nothing for Iran over the last 2 weeks. I mean, of course, Hezbollah is severely weakened and disoriented, but the Iraqi groups and the Houthis also stayed on the sidelines and did not come in. I think because they were deterred from doing so. So they did relatively little for Iran in this time of acute need. On the missiles and drones, one might think, well, can Iran really rely on that capability, and will it try to rebuild that, given that we've had such high Israeli interception rates? I think Iran will, because even if the Israelis have an interception rate of 95 or 98%, you know, if Iran can hold Israel at risk somewhat, I mean, if just one missile goes through or some drones go through and civilians are killed in Israel, to keep that that terror or that prospect of terror, you know, relevant in the future, I think will still be an attractive proposition to Iran. It will be natural for them to reconstitute that capability. It will also force Israel to hone down, to triple down on the production of interceptor munitions, or for Israel to be supported from other partners in that realm. So I think we will still see Iran reconstituting that pillar. But a question we need to ask going forward, I think, is whether Iran will also look towards other non-conventional, unconventional forms of deterrence or coercion, whether that's in the realm of chemical, biological, whether that's in the realm of terrorist activities. You know, the Iranians are probably back to the drawing board and assessing those kinds of options. In terms of China, I mean, it's interesting that China has also been incredibly cautious and kind of staying on the sidelines over the last 2 weeks. And I won't make a comment about what that means for European or German diplomacy, but I'll say that it raises interesting questions about how we think about the so-called axis of upheaval and what the partners within the axis of upheaval are actually willing and able to do for each other when push comes to shove. I still think that we need to think very seriously and continue to observe the military and defense cooperation that is happening between these partners, the learning from different battlefields that will enable these countries to hone their capabilities going forward. But I think we've also just seen a real test case where one of the partners is exposed to military attack and the others are doing relatively little. And so I think that raises some interesting questions about sort of weak links within the axis of upheaval and perhaps the limitations of the concept.
Thanks. András.
Just one short thing on the regime change aspect. I don't know much about Iran, so I bring a Russia parallel. From time to time, the question comes up whether the losses in Ukraine or a possible defeat may result in regime change in Russia because of people rising up from the bottom and they really want to remove the regime. And the cynical and perhaps sad answer to that is that regardless of the scale of a military defeat of an authoritarian regime, as long as the repressive apparatus is largely intact, it will remain able functioning. I mean, a few high-ranking Islamic Revolutionary Guard generals were killed, so what? The structure, the hierarchy is still there, is still functioning. Same goes for the Basij. So as long as the repressive apparatus is there, and it's not easy to remove a repressive apparatus entirely, because those guys usually don't go to the front line. They stay back in the hinterland, so they are much less suspected to losses. So I'm very skeptical about the aspects of any kind of regime change perspectives in Iran, because regardless of the military losses they suffered, they are still able and demonstrated many times fully willing to use maximum repressive powers. These capabilities have not been harmed in any decisive ways. The killed generals got already replaced. I mean, this is how military hierarchy works.
We've got about 2 minutes left. So, Jörg, if you would like to pick up any remaining questions and or react to what Hanna and András said, this is your opportunity. You have the last words. And you're muted, so if you could.
Oh, thank you. It's hard to have a last word on this very dynamic situation. What I'm most interested in at the moment is, will there be some kind of process now with the Iranians, maybe even a regional process to come up with some kind of security order for the region where it's not necessary to go in and hit Iran every other year or so. I can totally understand that Israel can live even with a failed state in Iran, failed government. They don't necessarily need regime change towards a more democratic Iran, which many people here dream of. They just need a regime that is deterred. But for the rest of the region, that would be a really, really bad situation, I think. And I'm not sure if the American government has the patience to actually try to translate these military victories into something more productive for the region. Israel at the moment is quite happy, I think, with what they have achieved. So I think that's something that the Europeans could try at least to propose. I don't know if they are the players to actually make it happen, but there needs to be some thinking, I think, about this.
Thanks so much, Jörg, Hanna, Notte, and András, Rácz, and to all of you in the audience for joining us this morning. We'll be back on future Thursday morning occasions, both on this conflict and others. Thanks so much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.